The envelope sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days before I opened it. Just a plain white envelope from Gene Trust Labs with my name printed across the front. Valerie Harper. I'd almost forgotten I'd even sent in the test kit 2 months earlier during one of those late-night impulse purchases when the wine was flowing and Nicole was laughing about how we might discover we're secretly royalty or descended from Vikings. It was supposed to be entertainment. A party trick. Something to laugh about over brunch. I never imagined that inside that envelope was a truth that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family, my father, and the woman who raised me. When I finally tore it open that Thursday evening in my Pearl District loft, I had no idea I was about to learn that my entire life had been built on a lie my mother kept buried for 40 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The results themselves seemed ordinary at first. Scandinavian ancestry, 23%. British and Irish, 31%. A smattering of Eastern European heritage. I scrolled through the percentages with mild interest, already composing the text message to Nicole about our distinct lack of royal blood. Then I reached the section labeled DNA relatives and my world tilted sideways. The screen showed a match labeled close family, first cousin with a confidence level of 99.7%. The name attached was Denise Castellano, 30 years old, living in Denver. I stared at that name for a full minute, my brain trying to process what I was seeing. I didn't have a first cousin named Denise. I didn't have any first cousins on my father's side at all. Dad had been an only child, something he'd mentioned throughout my childhood whenever I complained about my younger brother Brian getting on my nerves. Your uncle would have driven me just as crazy, he'd say with that warm smile of his, the one I inherited along with his green eyes and stubborn chin. My father, Thomas Harper, had passed away 8 months earlier after a brief battle with pancreatic cancer. The grief was still fresh, still caught me by surprise at odd moments when I'd reach for my phone to call him about something trivial before remembering he wouldn't answer. He'd been a high school math teacher for 37 years, beloved by students and colleagues alike. At his funeral, former students had lined up to tell me stories about how he'd stayed after school to tutor them, how he believed in them when nobody else did, how he'd changed their lives with his patience and kindness. That was my dad. Steady, dependable, always there. The man who taught me to ride a bike and helped me with calculus homework and walked me down the aisle at my wedding 3 years ago, even though Marcus and I had divorced 18 months later. I clicked on Denise Castellano's profile with trembling fingers. Her photo showed a young woman with dark curly hair and brown eyes, smiling at the camera with her arm around a golden retriever. Her profile was sparse, just the basics. Denver resident, worked in marketing, loved hiking and craft beer. Nothing that connected her to my family in any obvious way. But the genetic markers didn't lie. According to Gene Trust's algorithm, we shared approximately 12.5% of our DNA, consistent with first cousins, half-siblings, or other close familial relationships. The system also showed she had her results linked to her parents. When I clicked through, my breath caught in my throat. Richard Castellano, age 65. The system identified him as my close family match with an even higher percentage. Parent or full sibling, the label read. Probability, 99.9%. I set my phone down carefully on the granite countertop, my hands shaking so badly I was afraid I'd drop it. This had to be a mistake. Some kind of laboratory error or computer glitch. My father was Thomas Harper. I had his yearbook photos to prove it, images of a younger version of the man I knew, with the same angular features and that distinctive cleft in his chin that I touched reflexively now on my own face. But DNA tests didn't make mistakes like this. Not with 99.9% certainty. I picked up my phone again and navigated back to my matches, searching for any sign of my father's relatives. My dad's parents had both passed before I was born, but he had cousins scattered around the Midwest. Surely someone from his family would show up in my results. I scrolled through the pages of second cousins and third cousins, reading names I didn't recognize. None of them matched the stories Dad had told about his family. No Harpers at all. The realization crept over me slowly, like cold water rising. If Richard Castellano was my biological father, then everything I knew about my origins was fiction. My mother had lied. For my entire 35 years of existence, through every birthday and holiday and milestone moment, she had looked me in the eye and perpetuated a deception. I thought about all the times I'd been told I had Dad's eyes, his artistic sensibility, his terrible sense of direction. How many of those observations were genuine and how many were just convenient fictions we'd all bought into? My phone buzzed with a text from Nicole asking if I wanted to grab dinner, but I couldn't even process the words on the screen. I needed to understand what I was looking at before I could talk to anyone about it. I opened my laptop and typed Richard Castellano Denver into the search bar. The results populated immediately. He wasn't hard to find. Richard Castellano was apparently a prominent architect in Colorado, founder of Castellano Design Associates, specializing in sustainable commercial buildings. His company website showed a distinguished-looking man with silver hair and dark eyes, standing in front of one of his firm's award-winning projects. He had my nose. The recognition hit me like a physical blow. That slightly aquiline shape I'd always assumed came from my mother's side, there it was on this stranger's face. I clicked through to his bio page. Born in 1959 in Boulder, Colorado. Graduated from the University of Colorado with a degree in architecture. Married to Caroline Brennan in 1989. One daughter, Denise, born in 1994. The timeline spun out in my head. If I was born in 1989 and this man was my biological father, then my mother had been involved with him right around the time she married my dad. Or maybe before. Maybe that's why they got married in the first place. I pulled up my parents' wedding photo from the album I kept on my phone, the one I'd digitized after Dad's funeral. The date stamped on the back read June 15, 1988. Mom looked radiant in a simple white dress, her blonde hair swept up in an elegant twist. Dad stood beside her looking young and happy and completely in love. I zoomed in on my mother's face, searching for any sign of guilt or deception, but all I saw was a 24-year-old woman smiling at the camera on her wedding day. I was born March 3, 1989, 9 months almost to the day after their wedding. The timing had always seemed perfectly normal, even a bit old-fashioned. They'd waited until marriage, or so I'd always assumed. Except now I had to reconsider everything. Had my mother been pregnant when she married Dad? Had she known Richard Castellano was the father? Or had she genuinely believed Thomas Harper was? The questions multiplied in my mind faster than I could process them. I thought about calling my mother right then, demanding answers, but something held me back. Maybe it was the lateness of the hour, already past 10 on a Thursday night. Maybe it was the way my hands were still shaking and my voice would certainly crack if I tried to speak. Or maybe it was the small, frightened part of me that wasn't ready to hear whatever truth she'd been hiding all these years. Because once she confirmed what the DNA test was telling me, there would be no going back to the comfortable fiction of my childhood. Instead, I did what I always did when I needed to think. I grabbed my jacket and headed out into the Portland night. The Pearl District was alive with its usual energy, people spilling out of restaurants and bars, the streetcars humming past on their rails. I walked without direction, letting my feet carry me toward the river while my mind spun in circles. Dad had known me as his daughter. He'd never given any indication that I wasn't his biological child. Every report card he'd signed, every recital he'd attended, every proud smile when I showed him my design portfolio, all of it had seemed genuine. Had he known? Was he complicit in the lie, or was he deceived too? The thought that my father might have spent 35 years believing I was his when I wasn't made my chest ache with a grief that felt fresh all over again. I reached the waterfront and stood looking out at the Willamette River, its dark surface reflecting the city lights. A couple walked past holding hands, laughing about something I couldn't hear. I envied their lightness, their uncomplicated evening. My phone buzzed again. This time it was my brother Brian calling, probably wondering why I hadn't responded to the family group chat about Mom's birthday next month. Brian. My little brother who I'd tormented and protected in equal measure throughout our childhood. Did he know? Was he even my full brother, or were we only half siblings? I couldn't answer his call. Not yet. Not until I knew what I was dealing with. The walk didn't provide the clarity I'd hoped for. By the time I returned to my loft, it was nearly midnight and I was no closer to knowing what to do with the information burning a hole in my consciousness. I pulled up Richard Castellano's website again, studying his photo like I could divine answers from his pixels. This man had contributed half my DNA. He had walked around for 65 years not knowing I existed, building his architecture firm and raising his daughter and living his life completely separate from mine. Did he even know my mother? Had it been a brief affair, a one-night mistake, or something more? And if he didn't know about me, did I have any right to disrupt his life with this revelation? Sleep was impossible. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, watching the lights from passing cars sweep across the walls. Every memory from my childhood now felt suspect, filtered through this new lens of uncertainty. The way Mom had always been distant with Dad's family, claiming they made her uncomfortable even though they seemed kind enough during our rare visits. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The photos in our family albums that showed Mom and Dad's courtship, always careful to display the progression from dating to engagement to marriage to me. Had those photos been staged to support the narrative? I thought about Dad's parents, my supposed grandparents who died before I was born. Had they known? Was that why there were so few photos of them, why Dad rarely talked about his childhood in detail? The next morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical Portland weather that matched my mood. I called in sick to the design agency where I freelanced, claiming a migraine that wasn't entirely a lie. The pounding in my head was real enough, born from a sleepless night of spiraling thoughts. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, creating a document to organize what I knew versus what I needed to find out. Facts: Richard Castellano was my biological father according to DNA evidence. My mother married Thomas Harper in June 1988. I was born March 1989. Richard Castellano married Caroline Brennan in 1989, the same year I was born. He had a daughter, Denise, born in 1994, who was technically my half-sister. Questions: Did my mother know who my biological father was? Did Thomas Harper know I wasn't his biological child? Did Richard Castellano know my mother? If so, what was their relationship? I pulled up my mother's contact information, my finger hovering over the call button. Linda Harper still lived in Boulder, in the same house where Brian and I had grown up. After Dad died, we'd encouraged her to downsize, maybe move closer to one of us, but she'd insisted she wasn't ready to leave. Too many memories in these walls, she'd said. Now I wondered what memories she was really clinging to. Were they of the life she'd built with Dad, or of something else entirely? Something with Richard Castellano that happened before any of us existed? I couldn't call her yet. I needed more information first, needed to feel like I was standing on solid ground before I confronted her. So I did what any desperate person does in the digital age. I started searching for connections between Linda Crawford, my mother's maiden name, and Richard Castellano. The search yielded nothing obvious. No social media connections, no shared LinkedIn contacts, no wedding announcements or obituaries that linked their names. I tried narrowing it down to Boulder in the 1980s, searching for anything that might place them in the same location at the same time. I found Richard's college graduation announcement from 1982, listing him as summa cum laude from the University of Colorado's architecture program. My mother had attended CU too, studying early childhood education. She'd graduated in 1985 according to the diploma that hung in her home office. 3 years apart in school, but on the same campus. The fear and humiliation and confusion evaporated, replaced by a cold, crystalline rage. I looked at Derek, at Marcus smirking behind him, at the groomsmen who seemed to think this was all some kind of joke, and I made a decision. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I very carefully set my bouquet down on the altar, the white roses and baby's breath that I had spent hours selecting now seeming absurdly trivial. I straightened my shoulders, ignored the throbbing in my cheek, and spoke in a voice that carried through the chapel with perfect clarity. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, turning to address the congregation, "I apologize for what you've just witnessed. But I want you to understand something very clearly. This man just assaulted me in front of all of you. He has humiliated me with false accusations, violated my privacy by going through my phone, and then physically struck me when I tried to defend myself. So there will be no wedding today. Derek tried to interrupt, taking a step toward me, but my father had reached the altar by then, positioning himself between us with a look that could have melted steel. Derek apparently had enough self-preservation to take a step back. I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. What you all just saw is who Derek Hartman really is. Not the charming businessman or the generous donor or the nice guy you all thought you knew. You saw a man who thinks it's acceptable to hit a woman, to control her through fear and intimidation, to perform cruelty as entertainment for his friends. I turned to look at Marcus and the groomsmen, making sure they knew I was talking about them too. You all knew this was going to happen, didn't you? You were in on this little performance. Did you think it was funny? Did you think this would be a good story to tell later? Marcus's smirk had faded. He actually looked uncomfortable now, realizing perhaps that assault witnessed by 200 people including several lawyers and a couple of police officers wasn't quite as entertaining as whatever Derek had convinced him it would be. I hope you all understand, I said, my eyes sweeping across the congregation, meeting the eyes of friends and family who looked shocked and horrified and heartbroken, that I am not the one ending this wedding. Derek ended it the moment he raised his hand to me. And I want to be very clear about something else. I turned back to Derek, looking him directly in the eyes, wanting him to see that he hadn't broken me, that whatever he thought he would accomplish with this display had backfired spectacularly. You are going to regret this for the rest of your life. Not because I'm going to seek revenge or make your life difficult, though I promise you will face consequences for what you just did. You're going to regret this because you just showed everyone who you really are, and you're going to have to live with that. Every person in this room will remember this moment. They'll remember that you're the kind of man who hits women. And that's a reputation you'll never escape. The chapel was dead silent except for the sound of my mother sobbing quietly in the front row. I could see people with their phones out, and I realized with grim satisfaction that this had almost certainly been recorded. Multiple angles, multiple witnesses, absolute proof of what had happened here. I reached up and slowly removed my veil, the delicate lace that had belonged to my grandmother, the something old that was supposed to bring me luck and happiness. I folded it carefully and handed it to my mother, who had made her way to the altar with my father. Then I started removing the jewelry Derek had given me, the engagement ring, the diamond earrings he had presented as an early wedding gift, a bracelet from our anniversary. I placed each item on the altar next to my bouquet. These belong to you, I said to Derek. Or maybe to your company since I'm sure they were all business expenses anyway. I don't want them. I don't want anything from you except for you to stay away from me. Derek finally seemed to realize that this wasn't going the way he had planned. Whatever scenario had played out in his head, whatever outcome he had envisioned when he decided to humiliate me at our wedding, this wasn't it. Claire, wait, he started, reaching for my arm. I stepped back, and my father moved forward again, his voice low and dangerous. Do not touch my daughter again. Ever. Two of the guests had made their way to the altar, and I recognized them as police officers from the neighborhood where I grew up, friends of my father who had watched me grow up. They positioned themselves near Derek, not threatening but present, making it clear that if he tried anything else, he would face immediate consequences. Lauren appeared at my side, wrapping a shawl around my shoulders despite the warm September air. Let's get you out of here, she whispered, her arm around my waist. Come on, honey. You don't need to be here anymore. She was right. I had said what I needed to say. I had made my position clear. Now I just needed to leave before the adrenaline wore off and the reality of what had just happened crashed down on me. I let Lauren guide me down the altar steps, my sister Hannah joining us on my other side, the three of us forming a protective unit as we made our way down the aisle. The congregation parted like water, people stepping aside to let us through. Some were crying. Others looked angry. A few looked confused, like they were still trying to process what they had just witnessed. As we passed the back row, I heard someone say, I got the whole thing on video. Every second of it. We made it to the bridal room, and the moment the door closed behind us, my legs gave out. I sank into a chair, my hands shaking as the adrenaline finally started to ebb. Lauren knelt in front of me, holding my hands, while Hannah stood behind me with her hands on my shoulders. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen," Lauren said, her eyes shining with tears. "Claire, you were incredible up there." I didn't feel incredible. I felt shattered, humiliated, confused, and angry all at once. My wedding day, the day I had spent 18 months planning, had just imploded in the most spectacular way possible. The man I had thought I would spend my life with had shown his true colors in front of everyone I cared about. And somewhere in the chaos of emotions swirling inside me, I was starting to feel something else, a cold determination that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. My mother burst into the room, her makeup ruined by tears, pulling me into her arms. "My baby," she kept saying, "my poor baby. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." My father followed, his face still dark with barely controlled rage. He pulled out his phone, already dialing. "I'm calling Richard," he said, referring to his lawyer. "We're pressing charges. Assault, battery, whatever we can make stick. That son of a bitch is going to pay for what he did." Part of me wanted to tell him not to bother, that I just wanted to forget this ever happened and move on with my life. But a stronger part of me, the part that had spoken so clearly in that chapel, knew that pressing charges was the right thing to do. It wasn't proof of anything, but it was possible. They could have met at a party, a campus event, anywhere really. I found myself clicking through to Denise Castellano's social media profiles, studying photos of my apparent half-sister living her life in Denver. She worked for a tech startup doing content marketing, posted frequently about her hiking adventures in the Rockies, and seemed to have a close relationship with both her parents based on the family photos she shared. In one recent post, she was hugging Richard at what looked like a company celebration, both of them beaming at the camera. The caption read, "So proud of my dad for winning the Green Building Award. Proof that you can build cool stuff and save the planet at the same time." The resemblance between us was subtle but there. Same jawline, similar smile. Would anyone have noticed if we'd passed each other on the street? Probably not. But now that I was looking for it, I could see the genetic echoes. By early afternoon, I'd fallen into a research spiral that was equal parts illuminating and frustrating. I'd learned everything publicly available about Richard Castellano's professional life and almost nothing about his personal history. His company's website had a timeline of major projects but no personal anecdotes. His social media presence was minimal, just a professional LinkedIn profile. I tried searching for old news articles, thinking maybe there was some scandal or event that would explain a connection to my mother, but came up empty. The man was apparently exactly what he appeared to be on the surface, a successful architect with a stable family life and a reputation for innovative sustainable design. My phone rang, startling me out of my obsessive scrolling. Nicole's name flashed on the screen. I'd been ignoring her messages all morning, and apparently she'd had enough. I answered before I could talk myself out of it. "Where have you been?" "I've been texting you since last night," she said without preamble. "Are you okay? You never go dark like this." The concern in her voice nearly broke me. Nicole had been my best friend since we'd met in a graphic design course at Portland State 12 years ago. She knew about my divorce from Marcus, had helped me pack up the apartment we'd shared and held me while I cried over the failure of my marriage. She'd been at my father's funeral, sitting beside me during the service when Brian had to step out because he couldn't handle seeing Dad's casket. If there was anyone I could trust with this information, it was her. "I got my DNA test results back," I said, my voice sounding strange and hollow in my own ears. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "And? Are we Viking royalty?" she joked, but I could hear the uncertainty creeping into her tone. She knew me well enough to sense something was wrong. "Nicole, I need to see you. Can you come over?" The levity dropped from her voice immediately. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. She was there in 15, letting herself in with the spare key I'd given her years ago. She found me still at the kitchen table, my laptop surrounded by notes and printouts I'd made of Richard Castellano's information. She took one look at my face and pulled me into a hug without saying a word. When she finally released me, she sat down across from me and said simply, "Tell me everything." So I did. I walked her through the DNA results, the discovery of Denise Castellano, the shocking match to Richard that indicated he was my biological father. I showed her the photos, pointed out the resemblance I'd noticed, explained the timeline that didn't make sense with what I'd always believed about my parents' relationship. Nicole listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious with each revelation. When I finally finished, she sat back in her chair and let out a long breath. Okay. Wow. That's a lot to process. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. What are you going to do? I don't know, I admitted. Part of me wants to call my mom right now and demand the truth. But another part of me is terrified of what she'll say. What if my dad never knew? What if I'm about to destroy his memory by revealing that his daughter wasn't actually his? Nicole considered this carefully before responding. Val, your dad loved you. That was real, regardless of biology. Nothing you discover now can change the relationship you had with him. She paused, choosing her words carefully. But you deserve to know the truth about where you came from. Your mother owes you that truth. I knew she was right, but knowing it and being ready to face it were two different things. We spent the rest of the afternoon talking through possible scenarios, each one more complicated than the last. Maybe my mother had a brief relationship with Richard before she met my dad, got pregnant, and married Tom without telling him the truth. Maybe she and Richard had an affair during her marriage and I was the result. Maybe she knew exactly who my father was, or maybe she'd been with both men close enough together that she genuinely didn't know. Each scenario painted my mother in a different light, from victim of circumstance to calculating deceiver. I didn't know which version would be worse to hear. By the time Nicole left that evening, promising to check in on me the next day, I'd made a decision. I would confront my mother, but not over the phone. This conversation needed to happen face to face, where I could see her reactions and she couldn't hide behind carefully chosen words in text messages. I booked a flight to Denver for the following weekend, telling myself I'd use the intervening days to prepare myself emotionally for whatever truth was waiting for me in Boulder. The week crawled by with excruciating slowness. I went through the motions of work, responding to client emails and working on design mock-ups, but my heart wasn't in it. My mind kept drifting back to the questions I'd compiled, the careful phrasing I was trying to construct for when I finally sat down with my mother. I practiced the conversation in my head during my morning runs, in the shower, while lying awake at night. Mom, I need to ask you something about my father. No, too vague. Mom, I did a DNA test and found out Thomas Harper isn't my biological father. Too accusatory. Mom, there's something about my birth that doesn't add up. Too weak. Nothing sounded right. How did you ask your mother to confess to a 40-year deception? I finally called her on Wednesday night to let her know I was coming to visit. Valerie. What a wonderful surprise. She sounded genuinely delighted, which made my stomach twist with guilt. I wasn't expecting to see you until my birthday next month. Is everything all right? I forced my voice to stay casual and light. Everything's fine, Mom. I just had some vacation days I needed to use and thought it would be nice to spend a weekend in Boulder. Maybe go through some more of Dad's things if you're up for it. There was a slight pause before she responded. Of course, sweetheart. You know you're always welcome here. Should I make up your old room? We discussed logistics for a few more minutes, plans for meals and maybe a hike if the weather cooperated, all of it surface level and mundane. She had no idea I was coming with questions that would upend everything. When we hung up, I felt like I'd just told a lie by omission, setting a trap for my own mother. But what choice did I have? She'd had 40 years to tell me the truth. I'd given her every opportunity. Now I was forcing the issue. Friday morning I caught an early flight from Portland to Denver, my carry-on packed light for what was supposed to be a simple weekend visit. The flight was uneventful, giving me 2 hours to stare out the window at clouds and rehearse my approach one more time. I decided to ease into it, spend Friday evening being normal, then bring up the DNA test on Saturday morning when we were both fresh and alert. The plan felt both too calculated and not calculated enough. As the plane descended into Denver International Airport, I could see the Front Range Mountains stretching across the western horizon, the same view I'd seen hundreds of times growing up. Boulder nestled at the base of those mountains, a 40-minute drive from the airport. I picked up my rental car and started the familiar journey home, my anxiety building with every mile. Boulder looked exactly as I remembered it, that particular combination of college town energy and outdoor recreation culture that defined the city. I drove through downtown on my way to my mother's house, passing coffee shops and bookstores and outdoor gear outfitters, all of it achingly familiar. The house where I grew up sat on a quiet street near Chautauqua Park, a modest two-story craftsman with a front porch where Dad used to sit reading the newspaper on Sunday mornings. Mom's car was in the driveway, and I could see lights on inside despite the afternoon sun still providing plenty of illumination. I sat in the rental car for a moment, gathering my courage, before finally grabbing my bag and heading up the walk. The front door opened before I could knock, my mother appearing with her arms already outstretched for a hug. "There's my girl," she said, pulling me into an embrace that smelled like her familiar perfume and the lavender sachets she kept in all the closets. She looked good for 64. Her blonde hair now mostly silver but still thick and healthy, her face lined but animated with genuine pleasure at seeing me. I hugged her back, feeling the complicated tangle of love and resentment that had characterized our relationship for as long as I could remember. We'd never been particularly close, not the way some mothers and daughters were. She'd always seemed to hold me at a slight distance, affectionate but reserved, as if afraid to let me get too near. I'd chalked it up to her personality, her Midwestern upbringing that valued emotional restraint. Now I wondered if it was guilt, if she'd been afraid I'd somehow sensed the lie she was carrying. Come in," she said, ushering me inside. "I made your favorite cookies." "Well, attempted to. You know baking was always more your father's department." The mention of Dad hit me harder than expected. The house still felt full of his presence, his reading glasses on the side table where he'd always left them, his collection of math textbooks still lining the built-in shelves in the den. Mom had changed very little since his passing, as if preserving the space exactly as it had been might somehow keep him present. I followed her into the kitchen where indeed a plate of slightly burnt chocolate chip cookies sat cooling on the counter. "They're a little crispy," she admitted with a self-deprecating smile, "but I think they're edible." We sat at the kitchen table, the same oak table where I'd done my homework and eaten countless family dinners, and made small talk about my flight and my work and whether I'd heard from Brian lately. The conversation felt surreal, this performance of normalcy while the truth sat between us unspoken. That evening passed in a strange suspended state. We ordered pizza from the place that had been there since I was in high school, watched a movie neither of us paid much attention to, and eventually said goodnight with plans to make breakfast together in the morning. I lay in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by the remnants of the person I used to be, band posters still on the walls and yearbooks on the shelf, and tried to calm my racing thoughts. Tomorrow I would ask the questions. Tomorrow everything would change. I picked up my phone and pulled up Richard Castellano's photo one more time, studying his features in the dim light from my screen. This man was my biological father. Somewhere in this city, probably less than an hour's drive away, he was going about his Friday evening completely unaware that his unknown daughter was sleeping 20 miles from his house. The thought kept me awake long into the night, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around me, wondering if this was the last time anything would feel familiar again. Saturday morning arrived with bright sunshine streaming through the curtains of my childhood bedroom, a cruel contrast to the weight pressing down on my chest. I could hear my mother moving around downstairs, the familiar sounds of coffee brewing and dishes clinking. For a moment, lying there in the twin bed I'd slept in throughout high school, I could almost pretend this was any other visit home. Then reality crashed back and my stomach clenched with nervous anticipation. Today I would ask the questions that would either confirm or destroy everything I'd believed about my family. I dressed slowly, pulling on jeans and a soft sweater, deliberately choosing comfort over style. My hands trembled slightly as I brushed my teeth and pulled my hair back into a ponytail. In the mirror, I searched my reflection for signs of Richard Castellano, now that I knew to look for them. That nose, those cheekbones, the way my eyebrows arched. Features I'd always attributed to some vague blend of my parents now seemed to clearly echo a man I'd never met. I took a deep breath and headed downstairs. Mom was at the stove making pancakes, humming softly to herself. She'd set the table for two with the good plates, the ones with the delicate floral pattern that had been a wedding gift from someone whose name I'd never learned. Orange juice in a glass pitcher, fresh fruit in a bowl, butter softening in a small ceramic dish. She'd gone to effort, and the thoughtfulness of it made what I was about to do feel even more brutal. "Good morning, sweetie," she said brightly, glancing over her shoulder. "I hope you slept well. These should be ready in just a minute." I poured myself coffee from the pot, adding cream the way I'd learned from watching my father do it every morning of my childhood. My hands were steadier now, the decision made. There was no going back. "Mom, I need to talk to you about something," I said, keeping my voice level and calm. She must have heard something in my tone because her smile faltered slightly. "Of course, honey. Let me just finish these pancakes. We can talk over breakfast." We sat down across from each other at the kitchen table, the same positions we'd occupied last night, but the energy was completely different. I pushed my pancakes around my plate, suddenly unable to stomach the thought of food. Mom took a bite of hers, watching me with growing concern. "Valerie, you're worrying me. What's going on? Is it work? Are you having financial troubles? You know I can help if you need it." The offer was so characteristically her, jumping to practical problems with practical solutions, never imagining the earthquake I was about to trigger. "I did one of those DNA ancestry tests a couple months ago," I began, setting down my fork. "You know, the kind where you spit in a tube and mail it off. Nicole and I thought it would be fun to see our ethnic backgrounds." Mom's expression didn't change, but I saw her grip tighten slightly on her coffee mug. "That sounds interesting," she said carefully. "What did you find out?" "I found out that I have a half-sister I didn't know about," I continued, watching her face closely. "Her name is Denise Castellano. She's 30 years old and lives in Denver." The color drained from my mother's face so rapidly I actually worried she might faint. She set her mug down with a hand that visibly shook, some of the coffee sloshing over the rim onto the tablecloth. "I can explain," she whispered, but made no move to actually offer an explanation. "The test also matched me with her father," I pressed on, unable to stop now that I'd started. "Richard Castellano. According to the DNA analysis, he's my biological parent. Not Dad. Not Thomas Harper, who raised me and loved me and died 8 months ago believing I was his daughter." My voice cracked on the last words despite my determination to stay composed. "So yes, Mom, I think you need to explain. You need to explain 40 years of lies." She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders beginning to shake. For a long moment, the only sound in the kitchen was her ragged breathing and the ticking of the clock on the wall, the same clock that had measured out the seconds and minutes and hours of my entire childhood. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red but dry, as if she'd gone beyond tears into some territory of grief I couldn't name. "I never meant for you to find out this way," she said, her voice barely audible. "I never meant for you to find out at all." The admission hung in the air between us. Part of me had hoped she'd deny it, tell me there was some mistake with the test, offer some alternative explanation. But here it was, the confirmation that my entire life had been built on a foundation of deception. "Start from the beginning," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I want to know everything. How you met him. What happened. Whether Dad knew. All of it." Mom stood abruptly and walked to the window overlooking the backyard, her back to me. When she started talking, her voice had a distant quality, as if she was narrating someone else's story. "I met Richard in the spring of 1987. I was 23, working as a teacher's aide at an elementary school in Denver while finishing my last year at CU. He was working for an architectural firm downtown. We met at a gallery opening, of all places. A mutual friend had dragged me along, and Richard was there because his firm had designed the building." She paused, lost in the memory. "He was brilliant and charming and so passionate about his work. We started dating, and it was intense from the beginning. Looking back, I think we were both too young and too caught up in the romance of it all to think clearly about whether we were actually compatible long-term. I listened without interrupting, even though 1,000 questions burned in my throat. This was the story I'd come for, the truth I demanded, and I needed to let her tell it her way. By summer, we were talking about getting married. His parents loved me, my parents thought he was wonderful. Everything seemed perfect. Her voice tightened. Then in August, I found out I was pregnant. With you. She turned to face me then, her expression pleading for understanding. I was terrified, Val. This wasn't how things were supposed to happen. We weren't married yet. My parents were traditional Catholics who would have been devastated. Richard's career was just taking off and he'd been talking about opportunities in other cities. Everything suddenly felt very fragile. What did Richard say when you told him? I asked, needing to understand his role in this. Mom's face crumpled slightly. I never told him, she whispered. Before I could work up the courage, I went to a party at his friend's house and I saw him with someone else. A woman from his office. They were just talking, but the way he looked at her, I could tell there was something there. Or something developing. When I confronted him later, he admitted he'd been having doubts about us. He said we'd moved too fast, that he needed time to figure out what he wanted. She walked back to the table and sat down heavily, her pancakes now cold and forgotten. I was heartbroken and pregnant and scared. I went home to Boulder and barely left my apartment for a week. My roommate from college, Julie, was the only person who knew about the pregnancy. She's the one who convinced me to get out of the house, to come to a local fundraiser for the school where I'd done my student teaching. She smiled sadly. That's where I met your father. Thomas Harper. Tom was there volunteering, helping set up chairs and tables. He made some joke about my trying to carry too many folding chairs at once, insisted on helping. He was kind and funny and steady in a way Richard had never been. You barely knew him, I said, unable to keep the judgment from my voice. You were pregnant with another man's child and you started dating someone new? Mom flinched at my tone but didn't look away. I know how it sounds. Believe me, I've spent 40 years knowing how it sounds. But Tom was different. He didn't sweep me off my feet or make grand romantic gestures. He was just there, reliable and patient. We started having coffee, then dinner. I kept meaning to tell him about the pregnancy, but the words never came. And then one night, about 3 weeks after we met, he told me he was falling in love with me. He said he knew it was fast but he'd never felt this way about anyone before. She twisted her wedding ring, a gesture I'd seen her make countless times over the years without understanding its significance. That night, I let him believe you were his. We slept together, and 2 weeks later I told him I was pregnant. The timeline was tight but not impossible. He was shocked but happy. He proposed that same night, said he wanted to do right by me and the baby. We got married 6 weeks later in a small ceremony at the courthouse. My parents thought we were rushing things, but they were relieved I wasn't going to be an unwed mother. Tom's parents had already passed away, so there was no one to question the timeline too closely. Did Richard know you were pregnant when you left him? I needed to understand whether my biological father had willingly abandoned me or simply never knew I existed. Mom shook her head firmly. No. I never told him. By the time I realized I couldn't go through with telling Tom the truth, Richard had moved to Seattle for a job opportunity. I heard through mutual friends that he was dating someone seriously. It seemed like he'd moved on completely, and I convinced myself that telling him about you would only complicate everyone's lives. That wasn't your decision to make, I said, anger finally breaking through my controlled facade. You took away my right to know my biological father. You took away Richard's right to know he had a daughter. And you let Dad raise me under false pretenses. Did he ever find out? Did he die not knowing? The question terrified me more than anything else, the possibility that my father had been as much a victim of this deception as I was. Mom's eyes filled with tears that finally spilled over. He knew, she said quietly, and my world tilted again. He figured it out when you were 3 years old. You had to have blood work done for a minor surgery, and the results showed your blood type was O positive. Tom was a positive and I'm B positive. He was a math teacher, but he knew enough basic genetics to realize the impossibility. He confronted me that night after you'd gone to bed. I tried to process this new information, the revelation that my father had known for 32 years that I wasn't biologically his. What did he say? Mom wiped at her tears with a napkin from the table. He was devastated. Furious with me for lying, for trapping him in a marriage based on deception. We almost divorced. He moved out for 2 months, stayed with a colleague while he tried to figure out what to do. She looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. But he came back. He said that regardless of biology, you were his daughter. He'd been there for your first steps and your first words. He'd gotten up with you when you had nightmares and taught you to count and held you when you cried. He said that made him your father more than any DNA test ever could. The image of my father making that choice, deciding to stay despite the betrayal, made my throat tight with emotion. Why didn't either of you ever tell me? I asked. I spent 35 years not knowing. Even after Dad died, you kept the secret. Mom reached across the table for my hand, but I pulled away. She withdrew, accepting the rejection. Tom made me promise never to tell you unless you specifically asked. He said it would only hurt you to know, that it would make you question his love when you should never have to question it. He was adamant about protecting you from the truth. That wasn't protection, I said bitterly. That was control. You both decided what I should and shouldn't know about my own life, my own identity. I stood up from the table, suddenly unable to sit still. Did Richard ever try to contact you? Did he know you'd gotten married? Mom shook her head. I heard he'd married someone named Caroline and moved back to Denver eventually, but we never crossed paths. Boulder and Denver aren't that far apart, but they might as well be different worlds in terms of social circles. I built my life here with Tom, and Richard built his life there. It was like we'd existed in parallel universes. I paced the kitchen, trying to organize my thoughts through the chaos of emotions. Does Brian know? My brother, the son who came along 6 years after me, when my parents' marriage had presumably recovered from its foundation of lies. Mom's expression shifted to one of relief at this easier question. No. Brian is Tom's biological son. We had fertility issues after you were born, probably stress-related, but eventually I got pregnant again. Brian has never had any reason to question his parentage. So I was alone in this, the only one in our family carrying genes from a stranger, the only one whose entire identity had just been rewritten. I need some air, I said abruptly, grabbing my jacket from the back of the chair. I can't be here right now. Mom stood, alarm crossing her face. Valerie, please. Let's keep talking about this. I know you're angry, but we can work through this together. Work through it together? I laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. Mom, you had 40 years to work through this with me. You chose not to. I need to process this on my own terms now. I headed for the door, ignoring her protests. Outside, the crisp October air hit my face like a slap. I walked without direction through the familiar neighborhood, past houses where my childhood friends had lived, past the park where Dad had taught me to throw a softball, past the coffee shop where I'd spent hours studying for high school exams. Everything looked the same but felt fundamentally altered, as if I was seeing it all through new eyes. I ended up at Chautauqua Park, hiking up the familiar trail toward the Flatirons, my legs burning with the effort and altitude. The physical exertion helped clear my head slightly. My mother had been pregnant and scared and made terrible decisions. My father had discovered the truth and chosen to stay anyway. Richard Castellano had never known I existed. Each person in this triangle of deception had their own story, their own justifications. But none of that changed the fundamental fact that I'd been lied to my entire life. I sat on a boulder overlooking the city, pulling out my phone. The signal was weak but sufficient. I pulled up Richard Castellano's contact information from his company website, my thumb hovering over the phone number. This man was my biological father. He had a right to know I existed. But did I have a right to disrupt his life with this information? His wife Caroline had no idea her husband had a daughter out there. His daughter Denise, my half-sister, would suddenly have a sibling she'd never known about. Making this phone call would create ripples that would affect multiple lives beyond just my own. I thought about what my father, Tom Harper, would advise in this situation. He'd always been thoughtful and measured, encouraging me to consider all angles before making important decisions. He'd taught me that the right choice wasn't always the easy choice, but it was usually the honest one. He'd lived that philosophy even when it hurt him personally, choosing to stay and raise me despite knowing the truth. Would he want me to contact Richard? Or would he see it as a betrayal of the family we'd built together, imperfect as its foundation was? My phone buzzed with a text from Nicole asking how things were going. I stared at the message, unsure how to even begin summarizing the morning's revelations. Instead, I typed out a simple response letting her know I was okay and would call her later. The sun was high now, warming the rock where I sat. Other hikers passed by, couples and families and dogs on leashes, all of them living their uncomplicated Saturday mornings while my world cracked open. Eventually, I made my way back down the trail to my mother's house. The rental car sat in the driveway, a reminder that I could leave any time I wanted. I could drive to the airport, catch an early flight back to Portland, and never speak of this weekend again. But that would solve nothing. I'd still carry these questions, this disrupted identity, wherever I went. I found Mom in the living room, sitting on the couch with a photo album open on her lap. She looked up when I entered, her eyes puffy from crying. "I thought you might want to see these," she said softly, gesturing to the album. "Pictures from before you were born." I sat beside her, maintaining a careful distance. The photos showed a younger version of my mother with a man I now recognized as Richard Castellano. They were at a restaurant, at what looked like a hiking trail, at a party surrounded by friends. In every photo, they looked happy and young and completely unaware of how their story would end. "You really loved him," I observed, and it wasn't a question. Mom nodded, her finger tracing the edge of one photo. "I did. But love isn't always enough, is it? Sometimes timing and circumstance and all the practical things matter just as much." She turned the page to reveal photos of her with my father. Tom looked impossibly young, his face unlined and full of hope. Their wedding photos showed a simple ceremony with just a few friends in attendance. And then photos of her pregnant with me, Tom's hand on her swollen belly, both of them smiling at the camera. "He loved you from the moment he knew you existed," Mom said quietly. "Every ultrasound appointment, every kick I felt, every late-night craving, he was there. When you were born and the nurse placed you in his arms, he cried. I'd never seen him cry before. He looked down at you and said, 'She's perfect. Our daughter is perfect.' And he meant it, Val. You were his daughter in every way that mattered." The memory she was sharing should have been comforting, but it only highlighted the complexity of the situation. Tom Harper had chosen to be my father, had actively decided to love and raise me knowing we shared no biological connection. That was perhaps more meaningful than any genetic link could be. But it didn't erase the fact that somewhere in Denver, Richard Castellano existed without any knowledge of my existence. It didn't resolve the question of whether I had a right or even an obligation to tell him the truth. "What do you think I should do?" I asked my mother, surprising myself with the question. Despite my anger at her deception, she was the only person who'd been present for the entire story, who understood all the pieces of this puzzle. She closed the photo album and looked at me directly. "I can't make that decision for you. I forfeited my right to guide you through this when I chose to keep it secret for so long. But I can tell you what I think might happen if you contact Richard." She took a breath before continuing. "He's built a life with Caroline. They've been married for over 30 years. His daughter Denise is the center of his world based on everything I've observed from a distance over the years. Finding out about you will shake the foundation of his marriage and his family. Caroline might leave him. Denise might resent you for disrupting their lives. Richard himself might react with anger or denial or demand a paternity test even though you already have the DNA evidence. There's no scenario where this information lands gently. But he deserves to know, I countered. Just like I deserve to know. You can't argue that secrets are good when they've caused this much pain. Mom nodded in acknowledgement. You're right. He does deserve to know. I'm just asking you to go in with your eyes open about the potential consequences. Not just for Richard and his family, but for you. Once you open this door, you can't close it again. You'll be connected to these people for the rest of your life in ways you can't predict or control. We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of decades of secrets and lies pressing down on both of us. Finally, I spoke. I need some time to think about what I want to do. I'm going to head back to Portland tomorrow instead of staying through the weekend. I need space to process all of this. Mom's face fell, but she nodded understanding. Of course. I know this is overwhelming. But Valerie, I need you to know that I'm sorry. I'm sorry for lying to you, for taking away your choice about knowing your biological father, for all of it. I made decisions based on fear and I justified them by telling myself I was protecting everyone. But really, I was just protecting myself from having to face the consequences of my mistakes. It was perhaps the most honest thing she'd said all day. I wanted to forgive her, to reach across the gulf that had opened between us and rebuild some version of our relationship. But forgiveness felt premature when I was still standing in the crater of the bomb she dropped on my life. I'm not ready to forgive you yet, I said carefully. Maybe eventually, but not today. Today I'm just trying to survive the truth. That evening, I booked a flight for early Sunday morning and began repacking my bag. Mom made dinner, leftovers from earlier in the week, and we ate in near silence. The easy rapport we'd had when I first arrived was gone, replaced by the awkward formality of two people who'd run out of safe things to say to each other. After dinner, I retreated to my room and called Nicole, finally ready to relay the full story of my mother's confession. She listened without interruption as I walked through every revelation, every painful detail. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. That's heavy, Val. I'm so sorry you're going through this. Her voice was full of the empathy I'd needed all day. What are you going to do about Richard? It was the question I'd been asking myself since leaving my mother's house that morning, and I still didn't have a clear answer. I don't know. Part of me wants to call him right now and tell him everything. But another part of me thinks maybe ignorance really is bliss. He's lived 65 years without knowing about me. Does he really need this information now? Nicole considered this carefully before responding. Here's what I think. You're not responsible for protecting him or his family from the truth. Your mother did that for 40 years and look how that turned out. You have a right to know where you came from, and he has a right to know he has another daughter. What they all choose to do with that information is up to them, but keeping secrets hasn't worked out well for anyone so far. She paused. That said, you also don't owe Richard anything. If you decide you don't want him in your life, that's valid too. This isn't about obligation. It's about what you need to find peace with your identity. Her words crystallized something I'd been struggling to articulate all day. This wasn't really about Richard Castellano or his family or even my mother's decades of deception. It was about me and my need to understand the full truth of who I was and where I came from. Whether or not I chose to contact Richard, I needed to come to terms with the fact that my biological father was a stranger who'd never had the chance to be my parent. I needed to grieve for the relationship we'd never had while honoring the relationship I'd had with Tom Harper, the man who'd chosen to be my father despite everything. After hanging up with Nicole, I lay in bed scrolling through photos on my phone. Pictures of Dad at my college graduation, at my wedding to Marcus, at family holidays and random weekday dinners. In every photo, he looked at me with unmistakable love and pride. Biology hadn't mattered to him. The DNA test results wouldn't have changed how he felt about me if he were still alive. That realization brought both comfort and fresh grief. I would never get to ask him about those 2 months when he'd left Mom, about his decision to come back, about how he'd managed to raise me as his own without ever letting his knowledge of the truth show. Sunday morning came too quickly. I loaded my bag into the rental car while Mom stood on the front porch in her bathrobe, looking small and old in a way I'd never noticed before. We hugged goodbye, but it felt performative, both of us going through the motions because it was expected. "Call me when you get home," she said. "Let me know you made it safely." I promised I would, though I wasn't sure when our next real conversation would happen. There was too much unresolved between us, too much hurt that couldn't be fixed with a single weekend of painful honesty. The drive to the airport gave me more time to think. By the time I returned my rental car and made it through security, I'd made a decision. I would reach out to Richard Castellano, but not yet. I needed time to prepare myself emotionally for whatever reaction he might have. I needed to think through what I wanted from the interaction, whether I was looking for a relationship or just closure or something in between. And I needed to be in a stronger mental space than the raw, wounded place I currently occupied. This revelation had upended my understanding of myself and my family. Rushing into contact with my biological father while I was still reeling would be a mistake. The flight back to Portland was turbulent, appropriate metaphor for the weekend I'd just survived. I stared out the window at the clouds and thought about identity, about how much of who we are is shaped by genetics versus environment versus the choices we make. I had Richard Castellano's DNA, but I had Tom Harper's values and mannerisms and approach to life. I was a product of both nature and nurture, of biology and love, of truth and lies. Accepting that complexity would be the work of the coming months or maybe years. When I landed in Portland, the familiar gray drizzle felt welcoming rather than dreary. This was my city now, the place I'd built my life separate from my family's complicated history. I collected my bag and headed home to my loft, ready to begin the process of integrating this new knowledge into my sense of self. The DNA test that had started as a fun distraction had revealed truths I'd never anticipated. Now I had to figure out how to live with those truths and what kind of future I wanted to build, knowing everything I now knew about my past. The weeks following my return from Boulder passed in a strange fog. I threw myself into work with an intensity that worried Nicole, taking on extra freelance projects and staying at my computer until the early morning hours. Design work became my refuge, a space where I could control outcomes and create order from chaos. Every logo I refined, every brand identity I developed, every color palette I perfected gave me a sense of mastery that was completely absent from my personal life. My clients were thrilled with my sudden burst of productivity. I delivered projects ahead of schedule and volunteered for revisions without complaint. What they didn't know was that I was running from my thoughts, using deadlines and creative challenges to avoid confronting the identity crisis brewing beneath the surface. Nicole finally staged an intervention 3 weeks after my trip home. She showed up at my loft on a Wednesday evening with Thai food and a determined expression that told me she wasn't leaving until we had a real conversation. "You're hiding," she announced, setting the takeout containers on my kitchen counter. "I've known you for 12 years, Val. I know what you look like when you're processing versus when you're avoiding." I tried to protest, but she cut me off. "You've responded to exactly 3 of my texts in the past 2 weeks. You canceled our standing brunch plans twice. You're not processing. You're shutting down." She was right, of course. I'd been moving through my days on autopilot, completing tasks without really engaging with anything or anyone. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, the words coming out smaller than I intended. "Every time I think about reaching out to Richard, I freeze up. What if he doesn't believe me? What if he's angry that I disrupted his life? What if he wants nothing to do with me?" Nicole handed me a container of pad thai and settled onto my couch. "Those are all valid fears. But you know what's worse than any of those outcomes? Spending the rest of your life wondering what might have happened if you'd been brave enough to find out." We talked late into the night, examining the situation from every angle. Nicole helped me articulate what I actually wanted from contacting Richard. It wasn't about establishing a father-daughter relationship to replace what I'd had with Tom. Nothing could replace that, and I didn't want to try. What I needed was medical history, a sense of genetic heritage, and perhaps most importantly, the knowledge that I'd given him the choice to know me. The decision of whether to build a relationship could come later, after the initial shock had settled. But he deserved the opportunity to make that choice, just as I deserved the opportunity to understand the full picture of my biological origins. By the time Nicole left around midnight, I'd committed to drafting a letter to Richard. Email felt too casual, a phone call too abrupt. A letter would give him time to process the information before responding, and it would give me the space to articulate my thoughts carefully without the pressure of his immediate reaction. I spent the next 2 days writing and rewriting, trying to strike the right tone. Too formal and it would read like a legal document. Too emotional and I risked overwhelming him before he'd even absorbed the basic facts. I went through 17 drafts before I had something that felt right. The final version was straightforward and measured. I introduced myself, explained about the DNA test, and provided enough detail about my mother and their relationship in 1987 to help him place the timeline. I acknowledged that this information would likely come as a shock and offered to provide the DNA test results if he wanted verification. I included my phone number and email address but made it clear there was no pressure to respond. I wanted to meet him if he was open to it, but I would respect his decision either way. At the bottom, I added a photo of myself from a recent hiking trip, figuring he deserved to see what his unknown daughter looked like. Printing the letter felt momentous, like I was setting something irreversible in motion. I addressed the envelope to his business office, figuring that was more likely to reach him directly than his home address. The last thing I wanted was for his wife Caroline to intercept this bomb I was about to drop into their lives. I drove to the post office on a gray Saturday morning, the envelope sitting on my passenger seat like a live grenade. At the counter, I hesitated one final time before sliding it across to the postal worker. Once it left my hands, there was no taking it back. The waiting was excruciating. I'd given him my contact information but had no way of knowing when or if he'd respond. Mail took time, and even after he received the letter, he might need days or weeks to decide how to react. I tried to distract myself with work and friends and the rhythms of daily life, but every notification on my phone made my heart race. Every unknown number that called made my stomach drop. I existed in a state of suspended anticipation, unable to fully engage with the present while waiting for the future to arrive. 10 days after I mailed the letter, my phone rang at 7 in the evening. The number had a Denver area code. My hands shook as I answered. Hello? My voice came out steadier than I felt. There was a pause, and then a man's voice, deeper than I'd expected. Is this Valerie Harper? Another pause. This is Richard Castellano. I received your letter. The moment I'd been simultaneously dreading and hoping for had arrived, and suddenly I couldn't remember any of the things I'd planned to say. Thank you for calling, I managed. I wasn't sure if you would. He laughed, a short, uncertain sound. I wasn't sure either. I've read your letter probably 50 times since it arrived yesterday. I had to take a day to just sit with the information. His voice was calm but I could hear the undercurrent of emotion beneath the controlled tone. Valerie, I need to ask you something directly. Are you certain about this? The DNA test, I mean. There's no possibility of a mistake. I'd anticipated this question and had my answer ready. I can send you the full results if you want to see them. The testing company matched us at 99.9% probability of a parent-child relationship. They also matched me with your daughter Denise as half-siblings. The science is solid. I heard him exhale slowly. My daughter. You're my daughter. He said it like he was trying out the words, testing how they felt in his mouth. I had a relationship with a woman named Linda Crawford in 1987. We broke up in September of that year. You were born in March 1989. The timeline fits. She told me about you, I offered. About your relationship, why she didn't tell you about the pregnancy. I'm not calling to accuse you of anything or to disrupt your life. I just thought you had a right to know I exist. Richard was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion he was barely containing. I have a daughter I knew nothing about for 35 years. That's not nothing, Valerie. That's enormous. I've missed your entire life. Your first words, your first day of school, everything. Linda took that from both of us. The anger in his voice surprised me. I'd expected shock or denial or even rejection, but not this immediate protectiveness of a relationship we'd never had. The man who raised me was a good father, I said, suddenly feeling defensive of Tom despite everything. He loved me and supported me. I didn't lack for parenting. Richard's tone softened. I'm glad you had that. Truly. But it doesn't change the fact that I should have been given the choice to be part of your life. Linda decided for all of us, and that wasn't her right. We talked for over an hour that first conversation. He asked about my childhood, my education, my career. I asked about his work, his family, how he'd ended up back in Denver after his time in Seattle. We carefully avoided the more complicated questions about what this revelation meant for his marriage or his relationship with Denise or what kind of connection we might build going forward. Those topics felt too heavy for a first conversation. Instead, we traded basic biographical information like strangers at a networking event, which in a sense, we were. Before we hung up, Richard asked if I'd be willing to meet in person. I need to see you, he said simply. I need to look at you and see if I can find myself in your features the way I apparently can in the photo you sent. Would you consider flying to Denver? I'll pay for the ticket and hotel. Or I can come to Portland if that's easier for you. I thought about my mother living in Boulder, just 40 minutes from where Richard lived. The idea of being back in Colorado so soon after my last visit felt overwhelming, but Portland seemed too much my territory, giving me an unfair home field advantage in what should be a balanced meeting. I can come to Denver, I said. But I'll book my own flight and hotel. I'm not looking for financial support. I just want to meet you. He accepted this without argument, and we settled on a date 3 weeks away. That would give us both time to prepare emotionally and, in his case, to tell his family about my existence. I need to talk to my wife and daughter, he said. This is going to be difficult for them. Caroline had no idea about Linda. We were only casually dating when I met Linda, and after Linda and I broke up, Caroline and I got serious quickly. I never saw a reason to mention a brief previous relationship that hadn't worked out. After we ended the call, I sat in the silence of my loft trying to process what had just happened. My biological father knew I existed. He wanted to meet me. He was angry at my mother for keeping me a secret. He had to tell his wife and daughter about my existence, conversations that would likely be painful and complicated. I'd set all of this in motion by mailing that letter, and now I had to see it through to whatever conclusion awaited us. I called Nicole immediately to relay the conversation. She squealed with excitement and concern in equal measure. How do you feel? She asked after I'd given her the full play-by-play. I considered the question carefully. Relieved, I think. And terrified. And guilty about what this is going to do to his family. But also validated. He didn't deny me or accuse me of lying or trying to scam him. He believed me, and he wants to know me. That feels significant. The 3 weeks before my trip to Denver crawled by with agonizing slowness. Richard and I exchanged a few texts, nothing heavy, just brief updates about our days. He sent me photos of his recent architectural projects. I sent him examples of my design work. We were circling each other cautiously, both afraid of moving too fast or saying the wrong thing. He didn't volunteer information about how his family had reacted to the news, and I didn't ask. That conversation would need to happen in person. 2 days before my scheduled flight, I received an unexpected email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "From Denise Castellano." My stomach clenched as I opened it. The message was brief and carefully worded. My father told me about you. This is obviously a shock for our entire family, but I want you to know I don't blame you for any of this. You didn't ask to be kept secret any more than I asked to suddenly have a half-sister. I'd like to meet you when you come to Denver if you're comfortable with that. I think we should talk, just the two of us, before you meet with Dad. Let me know if you're open to it. The email sat in my inbox for hours while I debated how to respond. Meeting Denise felt even more daunting than meeting Richard. She was the innocent bystander in all of this, the person whose family I was inadvertently disrupting just by existing. But she'd reached out first, which took courage. Refusing to meet her would send a message that I didn't care about the impact my presence had on her life. I composed a response agreeing to meet her for coffee the day I arrived in Denver, before my scheduled dinner with Richard. The flight to Denver felt surreal. I was traveling to meet my biological father and half-sister for the first time, people who shared my DNA but had been complete strangers until a month ago. I'd packed carefully, choosing outfits that felt true to my style but also presentable, wanting to make a good first impression while not pretending to be someone I wasn't. The plane touched down at Denver International Airport in the early afternoon, giving me time to check into my hotel and freshen up before meeting Denise at a coffee shop in the Lodo district. I arrived at the cafe 15 minutes early and ordered a latte I was too nervous to drink. When Denise walked in, I recognized her immediately from her photos. In person, the family resemblance was even more striking. We had the same nose, the same way of tilting our heads when we were thinking. She spotted me at my corner table and approached with a tentative smile. "Valerie?" I nodded and stood up, and we executed an awkward half-hug that spoke to the strangeness of the situation. Here was my sister, a person I should have known my entire life but was meeting for the first time as adults. We sat down across from each other, and for a moment, neither of us knew how to begin. Finally, Denise broke the silence. "You look like him. It's weird, but you have his expressions. The way you just bit your lip while you were thinking, Dad does that exact same thing." I smiled despite my nervousness. I spent my whole life thinking I looked like my mother. Turns out I was seeing wrong. Denise stirred her coffee, her own nerves evident in the fidgeting gesture. "My mom is having a really hard time with this. Not with you specifically, but with the fact that Dad had this whole relationship before her that he never mentioned. She feels like their marriage started on shaky ground and she didn't even know it." The guilt I'd been carrying intensified. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cause problems in your family." Denise shook her head firmly. "This isn't your fault. Dad's been clear about that with both of us. Your mother made choices that affected everyone, but you were just a kid. You didn't even know until a few weeks ago." She paused, seeming to gather courage. "Can I ask you something? What do you want from this? From meeting Dad, from knowing about us? Are you looking for a family or just closure or something else?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself constantly. Honestly, I'm not sure yet. I wanted my biological father to know I exist. I wanted medical history and a sense of where I come from genetically. Beyond that, I don't have expectations. If we end up having some kind of relationship, that would be nice. But I'm not trying to replace his existing family or force my way into a place I don't belong. Denise seemed to relax slightly at this answer. "That's good. Because I have to be honest, this has been really hard for me. I've always been Daddy's girl, you know? And now there's this whole other daughter he never got to be a dad to, and I can see how much that's tearing him up inside. Part of me is worried he's going to try to make up for lost time with you and I'll get pushed aside." Her vulnerability surprised me. "I don't want that either," I assured her. "I had a dad. He died 8 months ago, and I'm still grieving him. I'm not looking for Richard to fill that role. I'm just trying to understand this new piece of my identity." We talked for another hour, trading stories about our lives and finding unexpected commonalities. We'd both studied creative fields, both struggled with anxiety, both had complicated relationships with our mothers. In another universe, we might have been close growing up. Instead, we were strangers trying to figure out how to be sisters across a 35-year gap. When we finally left the coffee shop, Denise gave me her phone number and made me promise to text her after my dinner with Richard. "He's nervous," she confided. "I've never seen him this worked up about anything. He really wants this to go well." The weight of that expectation settled on my shoulders as I walked back to my hotel. I had a few hours to kill before dinner, and I spent them alternating between pacing my room and staring at my phone, willing myself to calm down. Richard had chosen a quiet Italian restaurant for our meeting, neutral territory where we could talk without too many distractions. I arrived exactly on time and found him already seated at a corner table, nervously adjusting his silverware. When he saw me approaching, he stood up quickly, almost knocking over his water glass. We stared at each other for a long moment, taking in the reality of this meeting after weeks of anticipation. Then, unexpectedly, he pulled me into a hug. Not the awkward half-embrace I'd shared with Denise, but a full, emotion-filled hug that conveyed years of missed connection. "You're real," he said when he finally released me, his eyes damp. "I knew you were real intellectually, but seeing you in person makes it all so much more concrete." We sat down, and a server appeared immediately to take our drink orders, giving us a moment to compose ourselves. Richard studied my face openly, not trying to hide his scrutiny. "You have your mother's eyes," he said finally. "But everything else is Castellano. That jawline, those cheekbones. My mother would have adored you. She passed away 5 years ago, but she always wanted more grandchildren." The mention of a grandmother I'd never known sparked a fresh wave of loss for all the relationships that had been denied by my mother's secrecy. "Tell me about your family," I said. "Your parents, your childhood. I want to know where I come from on your side." Richard seemed relieved to have a concrete topic to discuss, and he launched into stories about growing up in Boulder, his father's hardware store, his mother's volunteer work at the library. He described his path to architecture, how he'd always been fascinated by buildings and how people moved through spaces. As he talked, I found myself watching his gestures, hearing echoes of my own speech patterns in his cadence. Denise had been right about the lip-biting habit. Watching the community sustain itself independent of my involvement felt like proof that healing was contagious, that strength could be passed from one survivor to another in an endless chain of resilience. Rise Again had grown beyond anything I imagined that day I filed the nonprofit paperwork. We now had a full-time staff of 5, an active volunteer base of over 40 people, and partnerships with organizations in 12 states. The curriculum I developed had been adopted by 3 school districts and 2 major hospital systems. We had trained over 2,000 people in recognizing and responding to domestic violence, reaching an estimated 50,000 people indirectly through those trained individuals. The pottery had become more than a hobby, evolving into a small business that provided both income and artistic fulfillment. I had a standing arrangement with 3 local shops that carried my pieces, and I did custom work for weddings and special events. The symbolism of creating beautiful functional objects from shapeless clay never lost its resonance, each piece a reminder that transformation was always possible with patience and the right tools. My relationship with forgiveness had shifted in ways I never expected. I hadn't forgiven Derek for hitting me, might never forgive that specific act of violence. But I had released the anger and bitterness that once consumed me, not for his benefit but for my own peace. He simply didn't occupy space in my emotional landscape anymore. When I thought of him at all, it was with the distant curiosity you might feel about a stranger whose choices led them down a very different path from your own. The anniversary of the almost wedding no longer felt significant. It had become just another day in September rather than a marker of trauma or transformation. That ordinariness felt like victory, proof that I had integrated the experience into my life story without letting it dominate every chapter. I could acknowledge what happened without being controlled by it, could use the lessons learned without remaining trapped in the pain of learning them. Standing at the edge of another autumn, I thought about the woman who had walked down that aisle 3 years earlier, believing she knew what her life would look like, confident in choices that were about to explode spectacularly. I felt compassion for her naivety but also gratitude for her strength, for the way she had responded in that crucial moment when everything fell apart. That Claire had made decisions that created the life I now lived, and while I wouldn't choose to repeat the experience, I couldn't regret where it had ultimately led me. The future stretched out full of possibility rather than predetermined scripts. I didn't know if I would marry someday or remain contentedly single. I didn't know how large Rise Again would grow or what new directions the work might take. I didn't know what other challenges or joys waited around corners I hadn't reached yet. But I knew with absolute certainty that I could handle whatever came, that I had been tested in ways most people never face and had emerged not just intact but stronger. The wedding that never happened had taught me more about myself than any marriage could have. It had revealed strength I didn't know I possessed, connected me with a community of survivors who understood pain that others could only theorize about, and given me purpose that extended far beyond my individual healing. Derek had tried to break me in front of 200 witnesses, but instead he had shown me exactly who I was capable of becoming when pushed past every imagined limit. That realization, that Derek's worst moment had catalyzed my best self, felt like the ultimate form of justice. He had given me a story worth telling, and I had chosen to tell it in ways that helped others rather than simply dwelling in victimhood. The viral video of his violence would always exist, but it would be forever overshadowed by the work I had built from its ashes, by the lives touched and changed through Rise Again, by the proof that survival could be beautiful even when the surviving was ugly. I was Claire Donovan, survivor and advocate, potter and speaker, friend and sister and daughter. I was someone who had been slapped at her wedding and had responded by building an organization that protected others from similar violence. I was living proof that the worst thing that ever happens to you doesn't have to be the most important thing, that you can take trauma and transmute it into something that serves the world. And I was, finally and fully, genuinely okay. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. Richard had assured me that they were working through it in couples counseling, but I could sense the tension my existence had created in their household. My relationship with my mother had improved incrementally, though we'd never recapture the uncomplicated dynamic of my childhood. She called weekly, always on Thursday evenings, and we talked about surface-level things like her book club selections and my latest design projects. We didn't discuss Richard unless I brought him up first, and even then, her responses were careful and measured. I could tell she was hurt that I'd developed a connection with him, that in some ways I'd forgiven his absence more easily than I'd forgiven her deception. But she'd made her choices 40 years ago, and now we all had to live with the consequences. Brian took the news about my biological father better than I'd expected. I'd waited 2 months after my first Denver trip to tell him, needing time to process my own feelings before managing his reaction. We'd met for dinner in Seattle, where he worked as a software developer, and I'd laid out the whole story over sushi and sake. His initial response was shock, followed by questions about what this meant for our sibling relationship. "You're still my sister," I'd assured him. "We grew up together. That doesn't change just because we're half-siblings instead of full siblings." He'd thought about this for a long moment before asking the question that had clearly been weighing on him. "Do you think Dad loved you less because you weren't his biological kid?" The question had pierced something tender in me. "No," I'd answered with absolute certainty. "If anything, I think he loved me more deliberately. He chose me every single day, knowing the truth. That kind of love might be more meaningful than biology." Brian had nodded, seemingly satisfied with this answer, and then surprised me by asking if he could meet Richard sometime. "He's technically your biological father, which makes him sort of connected to me too by extension. Plus, I'm curious about the guy who contributed half your DNA." His casual acceptance had been a gift I hadn't known I needed. Work became both my sanctuary and my showcase during this period of personal transformation. The design agency I freelanced for offered me a full-time position with benefits, recognizing the quality and volume of work I'd been producing. I accepted gratefully, ready for the stability and structure of a regular schedule. My colleagues knew nothing about my family drama, which allowed me to be just Valerie the designer at the office, not Valerie the woman navigating the complexities of a secret biological father. The professional success felt earned in a way that had nothing to do with my genetic heritage or family relationships. This was mine, built on my talent and effort alone. 6 months after my first meeting with Richard, he invited me to Denise's 30th birthday celebration. The party would be at their home, a modern house in the Denver suburbs that Richard had designed himself. Extended family would be there, including Richard's siblings and their families, people who'd had no idea I existed until recently. "I want them to meet you," Richard had said during one of our Sunday calls. "You're my daughter, and I'm tired of keeping that a secret from anyone. Caroline is on board with this. She thinks it's time we all moved forward as a family, whatever that looks like." The invitation terrified me. Meeting Richard and Denise one-on-one was one thing. Walking into a room full of strangers who knew I was the product of a relationship that predated Richard's marriage felt exponentially more daunting. But saying no would send a message that I was ashamed of my origins or unwilling to be part of his life in visible ways. I accepted, then immediately called Nicole to panic about what this meant and what I should wear and how I should introduce myself. "You're overthinking this," she'd said with her usual directness. "You show up, you're polite, you let them get to know you. You're not asking them for anything except basic human decency. If they can't manage that, it reflects on them, not you." I flew to Denver on a Friday in late April, the weather finally warming after a long winter. Richard picked me up from the airport, and on the drive to his house, he prepared me for what to expect. His younger sister Angela would be there with her husband and 3 kids. His brother Paul, the oldest of the 3 siblings, was flying in from Arizona with his wife. Various cousins and family friends would round out the guest list of about 40 people. "Angela knows about you and is excited to meet you," Richard said. "Paul is more reserved, still processing the whole situation. But he's agreed to be civil, which is all I'm asking." The house was beautiful, all clean lines and natural light, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the mountains. Caroline greeted me at the door with a hug that was warmer than I'd expected. "Thank you for coming," she said, and seemed to mean it. "Denise is really happy you're here." The party was already in full swing, music playing from hidden speakers and people clustered in conversation groups throughout the open-plan living space. Denise spotted me immediately and rushed over, pulling me into the kitchen where she was assembling a charcuterie board. "Okay, so I need to warn you," she said in a low voice, glancing around to make sure we weren't overheard. "Aunt Angela is very huggy and will ask you a million questions. Uncle Paul will probably just nod at you and then ignore you for the rest of the party. The cousins are cool, they've all been texting me asking about you. And Mom's friends are going to be overly polite in that way that's actually kind of uncomfortable, but just smile and nod." She paused, studying my expression. "Are you okay? You look pale." I admitted I was nervous, and Denise squeezed my arm reassuringly. "You're going to be fine. Dad's been talking you up to everyone. Half the people here probably already feel like they know you from his descriptions." The thought that Richard had been speaking about me to his family and friends, claiming me publicly as his daughter, made emotion swell in my throat. Before I could respond, a woman who had to be Angela descended on us with outstretched arms. "You must be Valerie." She pulled me into an enthusiastic embrace that lasted several seconds. "I'm Angela, Richard's sister, which I guess makes me your aunt." God, that's weird to say. I have a 35-year-old niece I just met. She held me at arm's length, examining my face with unabashed curiosity. "You definitely have the Castellano nose. And the eyebrows. Did you get Dad's height?" He was 6'2". Richard got his height, but Paul and I were shortchanged in that department. Her rapid-fire friendliness was overwhelming but genuine, and I found myself relaxing slightly under her warmth. The evening progressed in a blur of introductions and polite small talk. Richard's brother Paul shook my hand with a formal stiffness that confirmed Richard's warning about his reservations. The cousins, all younger than me by several years, treated my appearance as interesting gossip rather than a family crisis, asking cheerful questions about Portland and my design work. Caroline's friends were indeed overly polite, their curiosity barely concealed behind practiced social graces. Through it all, Richard stayed close, a steady presence that made it clear I was under his protection. During dinner, Richard stood to make a toast. The room fell silent as people turned their attention to him. "Most of you know that we're celebrating Denise's 30th birthday tonight, which would be reason enough for a party. But we also have someone special here that many of you are meeting for the first time." He looked directly at me, his expression full of pride and something that looked like regret. "My daughter Valerie. I only learned about her existence 6 months ago, which is both one of the greatest shocks and greatest gifts of my life. I missed 35 years of her life, and there's nothing I can do to get that time back. But I'm grateful for every day I get to know her now." The room was quiet except for the sound of Angela sniffling into her napkin. Richard raised his glass. "To Denise, for being an incredible daughter and for welcoming her sister into her life with grace and openness. And to Valerie, for being brave enough to reach out and giving me the chance to be your father, however belatedly." Glasses clinked around the room, and I blinked back tears while trying to smile appreciatively at the faces turned toward me. Denise reached over and squeezed my hand under the table, a gesture of solidarity that meant everything in that moment. Later in the evening, I found myself on the back deck with Paul, who'd stepped outside for air. We stood in awkward silence for a moment before he spoke. "I don't mean to be cold," he said without preamble. "This situation is just difficult for me to wrap my head around. Richard is my younger brother. I've always thought I knew everything important about his life. Finding out he had a whole child he didn't know about challenges that assumption." He turned to look at me directly. "But that's my problem, not yours. You seem like a good person who got dealt a complicated hand. Welcome to the family, for whatever that's worth." It was perhaps the most honest interaction I'd had all evening, and I appreciated it more than the effusive welcomes. "Thank you," I said simply. "I know this is strange for everyone. It's strange for me too." We stood together in companionable silence for a few more minutes before heading back inside, and I felt like I'd passed some kind of test I hadn't known I was taking. The party wound down around 10, guests departing with hugs and promises to stay in touch. Denise, slightly tipsy from birthday champagne, pulled me aside before I left for my hotel. "This was the best birthday I've ever had," she declared. "Not because of the party, though that was great. But because my sister was here." My sister. The alcohol had clearly loosened her emotional filters. I always wanted a sister growing up. I used to make Mom play this game where she pretended I had an older sister who was away at college. And now I actually have one, and she's cool and talented and nothing like I imagined but better. Her earnest confession made me laugh and tear up simultaneously. "You're pretty great yourself," I told her. "And I'm really glad I get to be your sister, even if we're figuring out what that means as we go." We hugged, and I realized that of all the relationships that had emerged from my DNA test revelation, this one with Denise might end up being the most uncomplicated and fulfilling. We hadn't grown up together, which meant we had no childhood resentments or sibling rivalries. We were simply two adults choosing to build a connection based on shared genetics and genuine affection. Richard drove me back to my hotel, and we talked about the evening. "That went better than I hoped," he admitted. "Angela loved you, which I expected. Paul will come around eventually. He just needs time to adjust to new information." He pulled up to the hotel entrance and turned to face me. "Thank you for coming. I know it took courage to walk into a room full of strangers who all had opinions about your existence. You handled it with grace." "I had good support," I replied, meaning him and Denise both. We said goodnight with a hug, and I went up to my room feeling emotionally exhausted but strangely content. I'd survived my first Castellano family gathering. I'd met aunts and uncles and cousins who were connected to me by blood even though we'd lived separate lives. I'd been claimed publicly by my biological father in front of his entire family. These things mattered in ways I was only beginning to understand. The next morning, Richard picked me up for breakfast at his favorite diner, just the two of us. Over pancakes and coffee, we talked about my plans for the future, both immediate and long-term. "I've been thinking about what it means to have a father again," I said carefully. "Not to replace Tom, because nothing could do that. But to have this new relationship with you. I want to do it right, whatever that looks like." Richard set down his coffee and leaned forward. "I've been thinking about that too. I'll never be your dad in the traditional sense. I wasn't there for your childhood or your teenage years or your 20s. I can't make up for lost time, and trying to would be dishonest to both of us. But I can be present for whatever comes next. I can be someone you call when you need advice or just want to talk. I can show up for the important moments in your life. I can be family, in the truest sense of that word." His words crystallized something I'd been struggling to articulate. Family wasn't just about who raised you or who shared your genetics. It was about who showed up, who put in the effort, who chose you day after day. Tom had been my family because he'd chosen me despite knowing the truth. Richard was becoming my family because he was choosing me now, trying to build a relationship across the chasm of missed years. Even my mother, despite her flaws and deceptions, was family because our history bound us together whether we liked it or not. "I'd like that," I told him. "I'd like you to be present going forward. We finished breakfast and he drove me to the airport, our conversation meandering through lighter topics like his upcoming projects and my plans for the summer. At the departure drop-off, he hugged me tightly. "I'm proud of you, Valerie. For how you've handled this whole situation, for building a successful career, for being a good person despite the circumstances of your birth. Your mother and Tom did something right in raising you, even if they made mistakes along the way." On the flight home, I thought about identity and how we construct our sense of self from the fragments of our experiences and relationships. 6 months ago, I'd thought I knew exactly who I was: Valerie Harper, daughter of Tom and Linda, designer, ex-wife, Portlander. The DNA test had shattered that certainty, revealing that my foundation was built on partial truths and loving lies. But in reconstructing my identity with this new information, I'd gained rather than lost. I now had Richard's architectural creativity and Denise's marketing savvy in my genetic heritage. I had Angela's warmth and Paul's measured caution in my extended family. I had a more complete picture of where I came from, which somehow made me more certain of where I was going. Nicole picked me up from the airport, immediately demanding a full debrief of the birthday party. As I described the evening, she listened with the attentive interest of someone who'd been following this saga from the beginning. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment before speaking. "You know what strikes me about all of this? You could have let the DNA test results destroy you. You could have spiraled into anger and bitterness about the deception. Instead, you used it as an opportunity to expand your understanding of family and build new relationships. That takes real strength, Val." Her observation surprised me. I hadn't thought of my response as particularly strong. I'd simply been trying to survive the revelations and make the best decisions I could with imperfect information. But maybe that was what strength looked like in real life, not grand heroic gestures but the daily choice to keep moving forward, to remain open to connection even when connection was complicated. I'd chosen to reach out to Richard when I could have stayed silent. I'd chosen to meet Denise when I could have kept my distance. I'd chosen to attend a family party when I could have declined the invitation. Each choice had required courage I didn't know I possessed. Back in Portland, I settled into my routine with a new sense of groundedness. The questions that had consumed me for months were gradually being answered, not with neat resolutions but with evolving understandings. I was Tom Harper's daughter because he'd raised me with love and intention. I was Richard Castellano's daughter because genetics connected us and we were actively building a relationship. I was Linda's daughter because she'd given birth to me and done her best, however imperfectly, to raise me. I was all of these things simultaneously, and they didn't contradict each other as much as I'd initially feared. Work continued to be satisfying, my portfolio growing with projects I was genuinely proud of. I'd started volunteering as a design mentor for a nonprofit that helped women-owned businesses develop their brand identities, finding fulfillment in passing along the skills I'd worked hard to develop. My social life expanded as I made an effort to say yes to invitations I might have previously declined, recognizing that isolation had become a habit during my marriage to Marcus that I needed to break. I started dating casually, nothing serious, just coffee and dinner with people who seemed interesting. I wasn't ready for another serious relationship, but I was ready to be open to the possibility. My conversations with my mother gradually deepened beyond surface pleasantries. One Thursday evening call, about 8 months after the initial revelation, she finally asked about Richard. "What's he like? Is he good to you?" The vulnerability in her question caught me off guard. "He's kind," I told her honestly. "He's creative and thoughtful and he's really trying to be present in my life now. I like him." There was a long pause before she spoke again. I'm glad you have him, even if I'm the reason you didn't have him sooner. You deserve to know where you come from." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was acknowledgement, and that felt like progress. We talked for over an hour that night, the longest conversation we'd had since my confrontation in her kitchen. She told me more about her relationship with Richard, the parts she'd left out during that first painful discussion. How young and in love they'd been, how the pregnancy had terrified her, how she genuinely believed she was doing the right thing by not telling him. I listened without judgment, trying to understand the 23-year-old woman who'd made those choices, separate from the mother I'd grown up resenting for her emotional distance. I was always afraid you'd find out somehow, she admitted. Every time you mentioned wanting to do one of those ancestry DNA tests, I'd panic and change the subject. I knew if you ever discovered the truth, you'd hate me. And I deserved that, but it didn't make the fear any less real. Her confession explained so much about our relationship over the years, the way she'd always seemed to hold me at arm's length, as if afraid to let me get too close and discover her secret. I don't hate you, I said, and realized I meant it. I'm angry about the lies, and I wish you'd told me the truth years ago. But I understand why you made the choices you did, even if I don't agree with them. The conversation marked a turning point in our relationship. We'd never be as close as some mothers and daughters, too much damage had been done for that. But we could be honest with each other in ways we'd never managed before, and honesty felt like a foundation worth building on. She asked if she could meet Richard sometime, and the request startled me. Why? I asked, genuinely curious. To apologize, she said simply. To tell him I'm sorry for taking away his choice to know his daughter. He deserves that from me. I promised to ask Richard if he'd be open to such a meeting, though I suspected his answer would be yes. Despite his anger at the deception, he'd never expressed hatred for my mother. If anything, he seemed to understand that she'd been young and scared and made bad decisions from a place of fear rather than malice. The capacity for forgiveness that both Richard and Tom had demonstrated toward my mother was humbling. It challenged me to examine my own grudges and resentments, to consider whether holding on to anger was serving me or simply weighing me down. A year after that first DNA test result appeared on my screen, I found myself standing in Richard's backyard during a summer barbecue, watching Denise argue playfully with Brian about the best hiking trails in Colorado versus Washington. My mother sat on the deck with Caroline, the two of them engaged in surprisingly comfortable conversation about gardening. Richard manned the grill, trading architecture stories with Paul while Angela's kids ran circles around the lawn. Nicole had flown in for the weekend, declaring she needed to meet this whole complicated family I'd been telling her about for months. The scene should have felt surreal, all these disparate pieces of my life occupying the same space. Instead, it felt natural, like this was exactly where we were all supposed to end up. I caught Richard's eye across the yard and he smiled, that particular expression of contentment that I'd learned meant he was exactly where he wanted to be. He'd told me once that discovering my existence had fundamentally changed how he viewed his life, forcing him to reconsider what really mattered beyond career success and material comfort. My mother's meeting with Richard had happened 3 months earlier, a quiet lunch at a neutral restaurant where she'd offered the apology she'd been carrying for decades. I hadn't been present for that conversation, giving them privacy to navigate their own complicated history. Richard had called me afterward to say it had been healing for both of them, that sometimes closure required facing the person you'd wronged and accepting responsibility. My mother had seemed lighter after that meeting, as if setting down a burden she'd carried for too long. The professional success I'd been building continued to flourish. The design agency had promoted me to creative director, giving me leadership over a team of talented designers and the opportunity to shape the direction of our client work. I discovered I enjoyed mentoring others, sharing the techniques I'd learned and watching younger designers develop their own voices. Richard had asked me to collaborate on the branding for his firm's new sustainable housing initiative, a project that combined his architectural vision with my design sensibility. Working together had revealed how similarly our creative minds operated despite the years we'd spent apart. Denise had become one of my closest confidants, the sister relationship I'd never expected to gain from this upheaval. She'd visited Portland twice, and we'd fallen into easy companionship, the kind where you could sit in comfortable silence or stay up late talking about everything and nothing. She'd confided that watching Richard and me build our relationship had inspired her to examine her own life more critically, to question whether she was living authentically or just following the path of least resistance. Last month she'd quit her corporate marketing job to freelance, a risk she attributed to my example of choosing creative fulfillment over conventional stability. Brian had indeed met Richard during a business trip to Denver, and the two had gotten along better than I'd dared hope. They'd bonded over a shared love of terrible science fiction movies and obscure craft beers. Brian had told me later that meeting Richard had helped him understand our family dynamics better, had given him perspective on the choices our parents had made and the complexity of love and loyalty. He'd started calling me more frequently, our sibling relationship strengthening as we both navigated this expanded definition of family. The dating that had started casually had evolved into something more substantial with a man named Alex, a structural engineer I'd met through Richard's professional network. The irony of meeting someone through my biological father wasn't lost on me, but Alex was kind and patient and understood that I came with complicated family baggage. He'd attended today's barbecue and was currently engaged in an animated discussion with Nicole about the Portland restaurant scene, fitting into my world with an ease that felt promising. As the afternoon wore into evening, Richard called everyone together for a toast. We gathered on the deck, drinks in hand, faces flushed from sun and laughter. A year ago, Richard began, his voice carrying across the assembled group, I received a letter that changed my life. My daughter Valerie reached out to tell me she existed, and in doing so, she gave me a gift I didn't know I'd been missing. She expanded our family and challenged us all to be more honest and more forgiving. He looked at me, and I saw tears gathering in his eyes. Valerie, you could have stayed silent. You could have decided that knowing was enough without disrupting anyone's life. Instead, you were brave enough to reach out, brave enough to weather the complications that followed, brave enough to build relationships with all of us. You've taught me that family isn't just about who raised you or who shares your DNA. It's about who shows up and keeps showing up, even when things get difficult. Caroline stepped forward and put her arm around Richard, a gesture of solidarity that would have seemed impossible a year ago. To Valerie, she said, raising her glass. For turning what could have been a crisis into an opportunity for all of us to grow. The group echoed the toast, glasses clinking, and I felt the weight of their acceptance wash over me. Later, as the party wound down and guests began departing, my mother found me alone on the deck. We stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Your father would be proud of you, she said quietly, and I knew she meant Tom. He always said you had more strength than you realized. He was right. I thought about Tom, about the man who'd chosen to be my father every single day despite knowing the truth. His love had given me the foundation to weather this storm, to build new relationships without destroying the memory of what we'd shared. I think he'd be happy I found Richard, I said. Not as a replacement, but as an addition. Dad always wanted me to have everything I needed to thrive. My mother nodded, wiping at her eyes. He did. And so did I, even when I made terrible choices about how to provide it. The DNA test that had started as a fun distraction had unraveled my understanding of identity and family, forcing me to reconstruct both from their foundations. What I'd built in the aftermath was messy and complicated and unconventional, but it was also honest and full of people who'd chosen to love me despite the circumstances that brought us together. I'd gained a father without losing the memory of the one who raised me. I'd gained a sister without diminishing my relationship with my brother. I'd gained a fuller understanding of where I came from, which somehow made me more certain of who I was becoming. As darkness settled over Denver and the last guests departed, Richard hugged me goodnight. Same time next month, he asked, referencing our standing Sunday video calls. Same time next month, I confirmed. Because this was what we did now. We showed up for each other, consistently and intentionally, building the relationship we'd been denied for 35 years. It wouldn't erase the lost time, but it honored what we could still create together. The drive back to my hotel took me through familiar Denver streets, past the coffee shop where I'd first met Denise, past the restaurant where Richard and I had our first dinner. This city that had once felt foreign now held pieces of my story, connections that made it feel like a second home. Tomorrow I'd fly back to Portland, to my loft and my job and the life I'd built independently. But I'd carry this expanded sense of family with me, the knowledge that I belonged to multiple places and people simultaneously. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.